The debate chamber echoed with 12 different voices, each representing a species that had mastered faster-than-light travel before humans had even invented the wheel. Ambassador Claire Bennett sat quietly in the newcomer's chair, a simple piece of metal and plastic that looked out of place among the elaborate seats designed for beings with tentacles, multiple arms, and crystalline bodies. "The data is clear," announced Counselor Vorthak, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence as he gestured with 3 of his 6 arms. "These humans possess no energy shields, no plasma weapons, no quantum drives. Their largest warship carries fewer guns than our patrol boats." The other council members murmured agreement. The hegemony's representative, General Thoros, stood nearly 3 meters tall with skin like polished stone. His deep voice rumbled through the chamber. "In our experience, primitive species either submit immediately to superior force or exhaust themselves in futile resistance. Either outcome serves the greater galactic order." Claire watched the discussion with careful attention, taking notes on a simple tablet that several counselors had examined with curiosity. Most advanced species had moved beyond physical writing, using direct neural interfaces or quantum memory storage. The human habit of writing things down seemed quaint and inefficient. "Perhaps we should consider a gradual integration process," suggested Diplomat Iris, whose species had been peacefully absorbed into the Council 3 centuries earlier. "The humans show remarkable adaptability. They learned our trade languages in mere months and have already established successful commercial relationships with 7 member species." This was true, though none of the Council members had examined why human merchants seemed so unusually successful at understanding the needs and desires of completely alien customers. They attributed it to luck or desperation rather than any particular skill. General Thoros dismissed the concern with a wave of his massive hand. "Adaptability without strength is merely survival instinct. We have observed their military responses to various test scenarios. When faced with superior force, they retreat. When outnumbered, they scatter. When their supply lines are threatened, they abandon positions. These are the behaviors of prey animals, not warriors." The testing he referred to had been subtle but thorough. Hegemony scouts had probed human space for months, expecting the standard responses that all species exhibited when faced with unknown threats. Humans had indeed retreated, scattered, and abandoned positions. What the general didn't realize was that humans had been studying the probes just as carefully, learning about hegemony technology, tactics, and most importantly, expectations. Claire finally spoke, her voice surprisingly calm for someone whose species' fate was being decided by beings who could destroy her homeworld with a single command. "The Earth government appreciates the Council's wisdom in these matters. We understand that our technology appears primitive compared to the wonders we've witnessed here." Several counselors exchanged glances. Most species reacted to their first council session with either aggressive posturing or obvious terror. This human seemed almost relaxed, as if she were discussing trade agreements rather than the potential conquest of her people. "We would welcome the Council's guidance in our expansion into the galaxy," Claire continued. "Our colonial efforts have been necessarily cautious, but with proper oversight, we could contribute meaningfully to the galactic community." The word oversight carried specific legal implications in Council law. By accepting oversight, humanity would essentially be acknowledging the Council's authority to monitor and control their expansion, military development, and trade relationships. Most species fought desperately to avoid such arrangements. Counselor Vorthak's eyes blinked in surprise. "You would accept formal oversight of your species' development, including military restrictions and territorial limitations?" "Of course," Claire replied with a slight smile. "We're new to galactic civilization. It would be foolish to assume we understand all the complexities and dangers involved in interstellar expansion." General Thoros leaned forward, his stone-like features showing confusion. In his experience, no species voluntarily accepted subordination unless they had already been defeated in battle. "You understand that oversight includes the right to intervene militarily if your species poses any threat to galactic stability?" "We understand completely," Claire said, making another note on her tablet. "Though I hope our small ships and simple weapons won't require much attention from your impressive military forces." The comment was delivered so straightforwardly that it took several moments for the implied message to register. This human had just acknowledged the vast superiority of the hegemony's military while simultaneously suggesting that deploying such overwhelming force against her people would be somewhat ridiculous, not diplomat. Iris found herself unexpectedly curious about human psychology. May I ask why your species seems so accepting of this arrangement? Most civilizations require considerable persuasion to agree to oversight protocols. Claire set down her tablet and looked around the chamber, meeting the gaze of each counselor in turn. This simple action had a strange effect on the assembled beings. Most species avoided direct eye contact with those more powerful than themselves, and prolonged eye contact was often considered either a challenge or a sign of madness. My people have a saying, Claire said. When you're the smallest person in the room, the smart move is to listen carefully and learn quickly. We've been watching galactic civilization for months now, studying your histories, your cultures, your relationships with each other. She paused, letting that information settle. Several counselors shifted uncomfortably. The idea that this primitive species had been studying them was somehow unsettling. We've learned that the galaxy is a complex place, full of ancient grudges, complicated alliances, and delicate balances of power. We've also learned that every species here became successful by finding their particular strengths and using them wisely. General Thoros interrupted with barely concealed impatience. And what strengths do humans believe they possess? Claire's smile broadened slightly. We're very good at making friends, General. We're also excellent at learning from our mistakes, adapting to new situations, and finding solutions that work for everyone involved. The statement was so simple and non-threatening that it almost sounded naive, yet something in the human's tone suggested deeper meaning. She spoke as if she were explaining something obvious that the rest of them had somehow missed. The council session concluded with humanity officially accepting oversight status, granting the council broad authority over human expansion, while promising full cooperation with all galactic laws and regulations. As the members filed out, most felt satisfied that another primitive species had been properly integrated into the existing order. General Thoros remained behind, studying the small human female as she gathered her simple belongings. Something about this entire interaction felt wrong to his experienced military mind, though he couldn't identify exactly what. Claire noticed his attention and approached his towering form without any sign of intimidation. General, thank you for your patience with our primitive questions today. I'm sure we'll have many opportunities to learn from the hegemony's vast experience in managing galactic security. As she walked away, General Thoros found himself wondering if he had just witnessed exceptional diplomacy or something far more dangerous. In his long career, he had learned to distinguish between genuine submission and strategic retreat. This conversation felt disturbingly like the latter, though he couldn't understand what strategic advantage humanity could possibly be seeking. 3 months later, General Thoros reviewed the tactical display showing human colonial space with growing frustration. The conquest should have been completed in a week. Instead, his forces had been chasing empty ships and capturing abandoned facilities for 67 days. The initial assault had proceeded exactly as planned. His battle fleet had arrived at the human colony of New Geneva to find their orbital defenses operational and apparently ready for battle. The space station's weapons platforms had even powered up and begun targeting his ships, following standard defensive protocols that Thoros had seen countless times before. Then something unprecedented happened. The humans simply left. Every ship, every person, every piece of valuable equipment vanished from the system in less than 6 hours. The orbital station's weapons powered down. Automated systems began broadcasting surrender codes, and emergency lights started flashing to indicate abandoned status. When Thoros's Marines boarded the facility, they found empty corridors, cleared computer banks, and detailed instructions for the safe shutdown of all critical systems. The instructions had been left in perfect hegemony script, along with apologetic notes about the regrettable necessity of evacuating before proper transfer protocols could be established. The humans had even left behind basic maintenance schedules and technical manuals translated into 6 different galactic languages. Thoros had initially assumed this was a tactical withdrawal to a more defensible position. His forces had proceeded to the second target, the agricultural world of Prairie Vista, expecting to find the humans massed for a desperate last stand. Instead, they found the same pattern: hasty but orderly evacuation, abandoned infrastructure, and polite documentation explaining everything the new occupiers would need to know. The third target, a mining colony called Deep Rock, had been completely stripped of population and portable equipment. The humans had left behind the mining facilities themselves, apparently unable to transport such massive equipment quickly. However, they had also left behind carefully documented safety protocols, environmental warnings, and detailed maps showing which tunnels were stable and which were dangerous. Colonel Vex, Thoris's chief of staff, approached with the latest reconnaissance reports. His species had evolved from pack hunters, and their military doctrine emphasized the complete destruction of enemy forces to prevent future resistance. The human behavior patterns made no sense within their strategic framework. "Sir, our scouts have made contact with fleeing human vessels in 7 different systems," Vex reported, his triangular head tilting in confusion. The ships refused to engage in combat. When approached by our interceptors, they broadcast surrender codes and submit to boarding. However, they carry no weapons, no military personnel, and no strategic intelligence. Thoros studied the reports with growing unease. "What do they carry?" "Civilians, sir. Families with children, elderly individuals, basic personal belongings. Each ship's crew cooperates fully with our inspections and provides complete passenger manifests. They answer all questions honestly and make no attempts at deception that our scanners can detect." This presented an unexpected problem. Hegemony doctrine called for the elimination of enemy military forces and the integration of civilian populations into their existing labor systems. However, these weren't defeated enemies being processed for integration. They were refugees fleeing a battle zone exactly as they claimed to be. "Where are they requesting to go?" Thoros asked. "Various destinations throughout Council space, sir. Most are claiming refugee status and requesting transport to systems with established human communities. All of their requests fall within standard galactic migration laws." Thoros reviewed the legal implications with growing irritation. The Council maintained strict protocols about the treatment of civilian refugees during military operations. Preventing legitimate refugee migration could result in formal censure and economic sanctions. However, allowing the refugees to leave meant that the human population of the conquered territories was effectively escaping rather than being absorbed. "What about their military forces?" Thoros demanded. "Someone is coordinating these evacuations. Someone is organizing the transportation. Where are their warships?" Colonel Vex consulted his datapad with obvious frustration. "That's the primary mystery, sir. We've detected approximately 30 human vessels that appear to be conducting military operations, but they refuse to engage our forces directly. They appear briefly on long-range sensors, then disappear before our ships can intercept them." "Stealth technology?" "No, sir, nothing that sophisticated. They appear to be using conventional drives and basic electronic countermeasures. However, their movement patterns are unlike anything in our tactical databases. They don't follow standard patrol routes, defensive formations, or supply line protocols." Thoros called up the tactical display showing known human ship movements over the past month. The pattern made no immediate sense. Human vessels appeared randomly throughout the region, sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups. They avoided direct confrontation but seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing near hegemony supply convoys, observation posts, and communication relays. "Are they gathering intelligence?" Thoros asked. "Unknown, sir. Our communication security remains intact, and they make no attempts to approach sensitive facilities. However, our supply efficiency has decreased by approximately 15% since the operation began. The supply problems were becoming a significant concern. Nothing dramatic had occurred, but small delays and minor complications were accumulating into major logistical challenges. Cargo transfers took longer than expected due to communication difficulties. Scheduled supply runs arrived late because of navigation anomalies. Equipment malfunctions increased, slightly but consistently, across all occupied territories. Thoros suspected sabotage, but investigations had found no evidence of deliberate interference. The problem seemed to result from accumulated stress on systems that had been designed for routine operations rather than extended military campaigns in unfamiliar territory. "Sir," Colonel Vex continued, "there's another concern. The refugee ships have been broadcasting requests for aid and sanctuary throughout Council space. Several member species have responded by offering temporary housing and resettlement assistance. This was potentially catastrophic for the hegemony's strategic objectives. The entire purpose of conquest was to acquire territory, resources, and population. If the human population successfully escaped to other council territories, the hegemony would control empty worlds with no strategic value. Have any council members objected to our operations? Thoros asked. Not formally, sir. However, several species have requested clarification about the hegemony's intentions regarding civilian populations. The Commerce Guild has expressed concern about disruptions to established trade relationships. The Diplomatic Corps has offered to mediate negotiations for a peaceful resolution. Thoros growled in frustration. The humans were somehow managing to transform a simple military conquest into a complex political situation involving multiple council members. Every day the operation continued, more species became involved in what should have been a straightforward demonstration of hegemony authority. Sir, we have one more problem, Colonel Vex said reluctantly. Our forces report that the abandoned human facilities are becoming difficult to maintain. The technical documentation they left behind is accurate, but our personnel are unfamiliar with human engineering standards. Several critical systems have failed because our technicians made incorrect assumptions about their operations. Thoros reviewed the maintenance reports with disbelief. The humans had built their colonies using simple, reliable technology that should have been easy for any advanced species to understand. However, human design philosophy apparently differed in subtle but important ways from standard galactic engineering practices. Equipment that should have operated automatically required constant manual adjustments. Systems that appeared redundant turned out to be interdependent in unexpected ways. The agricultural systems on Prairie Vista had begun failing within 2 weeks of occupation because hegemony technicians had disabled what they assumed were inefficient backup programs. Those programs had actually been managing soil chemistry in ways that the main systems couldn't handle alone. The mining equipment on Deep Rock had shut down completely when hegemony engineers had tried to optimize its operations using standard efficiency protocols. How long to restore full operational status to the occupied territories? Thoros asked. Unknown, sir. We're requesting technical specialists from the home fleet, but the transit time is approximately 6 weeks. In the meantime, we're maintaining minimal functionality using emergency protocols. Thoros stared at the tactical display, trying to understand what had gone wrong with his carefully planned conquest. His forces controlled 3 star systems but gained nothing of value from that control. The human population had escaped, the infrastructure was failing, and the operation was becoming a political embarrassment rather than a demonstration of hegemony strength. Somewhere in the empty space between the conquered worlds, 30 human ships continued their mysterious activities, and thousands of human refugees were finding new homes throughout Council territory. General Thoros was beginning to realize that winning battles and winning wars might be 2 completely different things. Captain David Park adjusted his translator device as he stepped off the transport ship onto the crystal-covered landing platform of Harmoniae, homeworld of the Melody species. The entire planet resonated with complex musical patterns that served as both communication and art form for its inhabitants. To most galactic species, the constant sound was merely pleasant background noise. David had spent 3 weeks learning to hear the emotional undertones that gave the music its true meaning. His diplomatic mission appeared routine. Earth's government was seeking expanded trade relationships with Council member species, hoping to establish new markets for human goods and services. The Melody species had shown interest in human entertainment products, particularly something they called movies that combined visual storytelling with musical soundtracks. What the Melody leadership didn't realize was that David Park had not been chosen for this mission because of his diplomatic skills. He had been selected because he held advanced degrees in anthropology, psychology, and systems analysis. His real mission was not to sell human entertainment, but to understand how the Melody species thought, felt, and related to other galactic civilizations. Elder Chorus Lorana greeted him with a complex musical phrase that roughly translated to, "Welcome, small singer from the silence." The Melody species referred to humans as small singers because their vocal range seemed limited compared to the elaborate harmonies that served as their natural language. "Thank you for this opportunity," David replied. His words automatically converted into musical tones by his translator. "We hope that sharing our stories might create better understanding between our peoples." He had brought a carefully selected collection of human films, each chosen not for their entertainment value, but for their psychological impact. The selection included stories about underdogs overcoming impossible odds, individuals standing up to corrupt authority, and communities working together to solve problems that seemed insurmountable. During the presentation, David watched Lorana's reactions carefully. The melody species communicated emotion through harmonic variations that were difficult for other species to detect, but David had studied their musical language intensively. He could see that the stories resonated with something deep in their cultural consciousness. "These tales of your people are fascinating," Lorana sang after viewing several films. "Your characters often achieve victory through persistence and cooperation, rather than superior strength or technology." "Yes," David agreed. "We believe that the most powerful force in the universe is an idea whose time has come. Sometimes the smallest voice can change everything if it speaks the right truth at the right moment." What followed was a 3-hour conversation about the nature of power, authority, and justice that had nothing to do with trade agreements. David learned that the melody species had joined the council not through conquest or negotiation, but because their homeworld happened to be located along a crucial trade route. They provided services willingly but had never been consulted about the larger direction of galactic civilization. More importantly, David discovered that the melody species possessed the galaxy's most sophisticated communication network. Their musical language could be transmitted across vast distances using quantum resonance fields, allowing for instantaneous communication between star systems. Most council members use this network for simple message transmission, unaware that the melody species automatically archived and analyzed every communication that passed through their systems. "Your story suggests that individuals have the right to determine their own destiny," Lorana observed. "This is an unusual concept. Most council species accept that destiny is determined by those with superior power or wisdom." David sensed an opportunity. "What do you think? Should individuals have the right to choose their own path, or should they accept the choices made by others?" The question hung in the air, converted into a haunting musical phrase that seemed to echo throughout the crystal chambers. Lorana's response came as a complex harmony that expressed both longing and uncertainty. "We have never been asked such a question before," she sang. "The council determines policy. The hegemony enforces order. We provide services. This has always been the natural way of things." "Natural according to whom?" David asked gently. The next phase of his mission took him to the Commerce Guild headquarters, a massive trading station that served as the economic heart of the galaxy. Here he met with Trade Minister Brix, whose species had evolved from merchants and negotiators. They understood value, exchange, and mutual benefit better than any other galactic civilization. David's proposal seemed straightforward. Human manufacturers were interested in establishing production facilities throughout council space, offering employment opportunities and technology transfer to interested partners. The benefits appeared mutual. Humans gained access to galactic markets while local populations gained jobs and technical knowledge. Trade Minister Brix reviewed the proposals with obvious interest. Human manufacturing techniques were primitive by galactic standards, but they were also remarkably efficient and adaptable. More importantly, human products seemed to appeal to a wide range of species despite their simple technology. "Your people have an unusual approach to manufacturing," Brix observed. "Most species optimize for either maximum efficiency or maximum quality. Humans seem to optimize for reliability and adaptability. We've learned that the best solution is usually the one that works consistently under the widest range of conditions," David explained. "We'd rather have equipment that functions adequately in any environment than equipment that functions perfectly in only one environment." This philosophy appealed strongly to the Commerce Guild, which dealt constantly with the challenge of adapting products for dozens of different species with varying needs and preferences. Human manufacturing principles could revolutionize galactic trade if implemented broadly. However, David's real objective was to understand the economic relationships that held the council together. Through carefully worded questions and attentive listening, he learned about the complex web of dependencies that linked various species together. The hegemony provided military security in exchange for preferential trade agreements. The Commerce Guild controlled critical supply chains that could be disrupted if their cooperation was withdrawn. The diplomatic corps maintained stability through a careful balance of competing interests. Most importantly, David discovered that the current system benefited some species far more than others. The hegemony consumed vast quantities of resources to maintain their military forces, but contributed little to the galactic economy. Several smaller species provided essential services, but received minimal compensation. The entire structure depended on everyone accepting that the current arrangement was inevitable and unchangeable. "Minister Bricks," David said during their final meeting, "suppose someone offered you a different arrangement. Instead of the current system where trade relationships are determined by military power, imagine a system where they were determined by mutual benefit and voluntary cooperation. Would such a system be more or less profitable for the Commerce Guild?" The question clearly intrigued Bricks, whose species naturally thought in terms of cost-benefit analysis. "Such a system would theoretically be more profitable for all participants," Bricks admitted. "However, it would require trust between species that have never cooperated as equals." "Trust has to start somewhere," David observed. "Usually with someone taking the first step and proving that cooperation works better than coercion." Meanwhile, other human diplomatic teams were having similar conversations throughout Council. Space. Dr. Amy Rodriguez was introducing human agricultural techniques to the farming worlds while learning about their resentment toward hegemony food requisitions. Technical specialist Robert Kim was sharing human computer systems with the research stations while discovering their frustration with restricted access to advanced technologies. None of these conversations appeared threatening or subversive. Human diplomats were simply asking questions, sharing ideas, and listening carefully to the responses. They were building relationships based on mutual respect and genuine interest in other species' perspectives. However, the cumulative effect was beginning to change how various council members thought about their relationships with each other and with the galactic power structure. Species that had never questioned the existing order were suddenly wondering whether alternatives might be possible. Groups that had accepted their subordinate status were beginning to consider whether they deserved better treatment. Captain David Park filed his final report as he departed the Commerce Guild station. His mission had been officially successful. Earth had established new trade relationships, expanded their diplomatic contacts, and gained valuable cultural understanding of their galactic neighbors. Unofficially, he had mapped the social and economic networks that could be influenced, identified key individuals who might be open to change, and planted seeds of ideas that would grow into something far more significant than anyone yet realized. The hegemony was still focused on their conquest of human space, completely unaware that humanity was quietly building the foundation for a very different kind of war. Dr. Amy Rodriguez crouched in the underground laboratory beneath the surface of Kepler Prime, watching through microscopes as Earth insects explored their new alien environment. The laboratory had been carved out of solid rock 3 months earlier by human mining equipment, hidden beneath what appeared to be a simple agricultural research station. Above ground, the facility looked like dozens of other scientific outposts scattered throughout the galaxy. Researchers studied soil composition, tested crop yields, and published papers about agricultural efficiency that were read by farming specialists across council space. Below ground, Amy's team was conducting a very different kind of research. "The test results are promising," reported Dr. Lisa Wong, holding up a sealed container filled with what looked like ordinary dirt. "Earth termites can process hegemony construction materials approximately 30% faster than they process wood. Their digestive chemistry seems perfectly suited to breaking down the polymers used in their building foundations." Amy nodded, making notes on her tablet. The discovery had been accidental at first. Human agricultural teams had noticed that certain Earth insects seemed unusually active around alien materials. Further investigation revealed that several Earth species could thrive on substances that were completely artificial to their evolution, apparently because their digestive systems were more adaptable than expected. "What about the dispersal mechanism?" Amy asked. Dr. Robert Kim looked up from his computer workstation, where multiple data streams showed information flows throughout hegemony space. "The shipping containers are in place. Normal commercial cargo runs will distribute the specimens to 17 different hegemony worlds over the next 6 weeks. The insects will be packaged with standard agricultural supplies completely invisible to cargo inspections." The plan was elegantly simple. Earth insects would be introduced to hegemony worlds through routine trade shipments, disguised as minor contamination in agricultural products. Once released, they would establish colonies in areas where they could access the specific materials they had learned to digest. Within months, critical infrastructure would begin experiencing mysterious but consistent degradation. Remember, Amy emphasized to her team, we're not trying to cause catastrophic damage. The goal is persistent, low-level problems that accumulate over time, buildings that need more frequent maintenance, support structures that wear out faster than expected. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger immediate investigation, but enough to strain their resources and reduce their operational efficiency. Meanwhile, in a secure facility on the other side of the galaxy, Robert Kim's team was conducting their own form of indirect warfare. They had spent months studying hegemony communication networks, learning the protocols and procedures that kept their vast military machine functioning smoothly. The beauty of their system is its efficiency, explained technical specialist Brian Miller, pointing to diagrams showing hegemony data flows. Everything is automated, integrated, and optimized for maximum speed and reliability. Messages are processed and forwarded without human intervention. Supply requests are filled automatically, and personnel assignments are handled by artificial intelligence. Robert studied the network architecture with professional admiration. The hegemony had built the most sophisticated military communication system in galactic history. It was also completely vulnerable to the kind of subtle interference that human hackers had perfected over centuries of dealing with complex digital systems. We're not going to break their communications, Robert explained to his team. We're going to make them slightly less reliable. Messages will still get through, but they'll arrive a few minutes later than expected. Supply requests will still be processed, but occasional items will be forgotten or delivered to the wrong locations. Personnel assignments will still function, but sometimes people will receive orders that are technically correct but practically confusing. The modifications were so subtle that they appeared to be normal system variations rather than deliberate interference. When a supply convoy arrived 6 hours late because of navigation database irregularities, it seemed like ordinary technical difficulties. When military units received contradictory orders because of communication protocol variations, it looked like bureaucratic inefficiency rather than sabotage. The psychological warfare campaign was being conducted by Dr. Sarah Mitchell and her team of human behavioral specialists. They had spent years studying hegemony culture, learning how their society functioned and what values held their civilization together. The hegemony's entire identity is based on the concept of inevitable victory. Sarah explained during a strategy meeting conducted in a hidden facility within an asteroid mining operation. Their soldiers believe they represent a superior form of life destined to bring order to the galaxy. Their civilians accept the hardships of constant military expansion because they believe it serves a noble purpose. The human approach was to introduce ideas that challenge these fundamental assumptions without directly attacking them. Human agents posing as merchants, researchers, and refugees would engage hegemony citizens in casual conversations about alternative ways of organizing society. What if strength came from cooperation rather than domination? They would ask. What if security came from friendship rather than fear? What if progress came from creativity rather than conquest? These questions were presented as philosophical curiosities rather than challenges to hegemony authority. However, they planted seeds of doubt that grew in unexpected ways. Hegemony soldiers began wondering whether their sacrifices were truly necessary. Hegemony civilians began questioning whether constant expansion was actually making their lives better. The campaign was carefully designed to avoid creating martyrs or triggering violent reactions. Instead of opposing hegemony values directly, human agents simply offered alternative perspectives and let hegemony citizens draw their own conclusions. We're not trying to convince them that they're wrong, Sarah emphasized. We're trying to convince them that they have choices. Once people realize they can choose differently, they usually do. The cumulative effect of these operations was becoming apparent throughout hegemony space. General Thoros noticed it first as a gradual decline in operational efficiency. Supply convoys arrived late more frequently. Equipment failed at higher rates than statistical models predicted. Communication delays accumulated into significant coordination problems. More troubling were the reports from intelligence officers about declining morale among both military and civilian populations. Recruitment rates had dropped by 15% over the past 4 months. Requests for transfer to non-combat positions had increased by 23%. Even among loyal hegemony citizens, there seemed to be growing uncertainty about the wisdom of continued expansion. "Sir," reported Colonel Vex during a briefing aboard the flagship Dominance, "our analysts have detected patterns in these problems that suggest coordinated interference. The incidents are too numerous and too well-timed to be coincidental." General Thoreau studied the accumulated data with growing unease. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Someone was conducting a systematic campaign against hegemony operations, using methods that were difficult to detect and impossible to prevent through conventional military responses. "Do we have any evidence linking these incidents to human activity?" Thoreau asked. "Nothing definitive, sir. However, the timing correlates with the beginning of our operations in human space. Also, several of the technical problems involve systems that were functioning normally until we began occupying human territories." Thoreau considered the implications. If humans were responsible for this campaign, they were demonstrating capabilities that his intelligence services had completely failed to detect. More importantly, they were fighting a kind of war that hegemony doctrine had never anticipated. "What are our options for response?" Thoreau asked. Colonel Vex consulted his tactical database with obvious frustration. "Standard counterinsurgency protocols require identifying enemy bases, supply lines, and command structures. However, we cannot locate any centralized human military organization. Standard deterrence protocols require threatening targets that the enemy values. However, human populations have already evacuated to neutral territories beyond our reach. The hegemony war machine had been designed to fight conventional enemies using conventional methods. It could destroy fleets, conquer planets, and occupy territories with devastating efficiency. However, it had no effective response to an enemy that refused to present conventional targets while conducting persistent, low-level operations that degraded overall effectiveness without triggering clear retaliation thresholds. "Sir," Colonel Vex continued, "there's another concern. Our operations against human space were intended to demonstrate hegemony strength to other council species. However, the prolonged nature of the campaign and the various operational difficulties we've experienced may be having the opposite effect." Thoreau reviewed intelligence reports about council reactions to the ongoing conflict. Several species were asking pointed questions about why the mighty hegemony was having so much difficulty with a primitive human civilization. Others were offering to mediate a peaceful resolution, implying that continued military action was unnecessary and potentially counterproductive. Most disturbing were reports that some council members were beginning to wonder whether the hegemony's protection was as valuable as they had previously believed. If humans could cause this much trouble for the galaxy's most powerful military force, perhaps hegemony dominance was not as inevitable as everyone had assumed. General Thoreau realized that he was fighting an enemy that understood something fundamental about warfare that his own species had never considered. Victory was not just about destroying the enemy's ability to fight. It was about destroying the enemy's will to fight and, more importantly, convincing everyone else that fighting was pointless. The humans were demonstrating that the hegemony could be frustrated, delayed, and gradually worn down by an opponent that refused to play by the established rules. More dangerous still, they were proving that hegemony power was not absolute and that resistance was not futile. For the first time in his long military career, General Thoreau began to wonder whether winning this war might be impossible. Regardless of how many battles his forces won, Commander Lisa Wong sat in a reinforced bunker deep beneath the surface of an unnamed asteroid, surrounded by communication equipment that could broadcast to every inhabited system in the galaxy. The facility had been built over 6 months using mining equipment and construction materials that officially didn't exist, hidden within what appeared to be a routine asteroid harvesting operation. Her team represented the final phase of humanity's unconventional war against the hegemony. They were not soldiers in any traditional sense. Lisa held degrees in journalism and mass communication. Dr. Martin Chen was a documentary filmmaker. Captain Jennifer Adams was a specialist in interspecies psychology. Together, they were about to launch the most devastating weapon in humanity's arsenal, the truth. "Are we ready for the first broadcast?" Lisa asked, checking the status displays that showed communication links to 12 different star systems, All transmission arrays are operational, reported technical. Specialist David Kim. We have confirmed reception. Capability on 47 different worlds, including 8 hegemony territories. The quantum resonance network provided by the Melody species is functioning perfectly. The Melody species had agreed to carry human transmissions through their communication network after months of careful diplomacy. They believed they were simply providing commercial broadcasting services for human entertainment programs. They had no idea they were about to become the backbone of a galaxy-wide information campaign. What about our sources? Lisa asked. Dr. Chen checked his data files, which contained thousands of hours of recorded testimony from refugees, witnesses, and former hegemony subjects. We have documented evidence of hegemony operations on 73 different worlds, spanning the past 2 centuries. Video testimonies, official documents, communication intercepts, and medical records. Everything has been verified through multiple independent sources. The evidence told a story that most galactic citizens had never heard. The hegemony's expansion across the galaxy had involved the conquest and subjugation of hundreds of species, many of which had been peaceful civilizations that posed no threat to anyone. Entire cultures had been destroyed or forcibly integrated into hegemony society. Billions of individuals had been relocated, enslaved, or eliminated when they proved insufficiently useful. Remember, Lisa emphasized, we're not trying to convince anyone that the hegemony is evil. We're simply asking questions that people should have been asking all along. Why is conquest acceptable? Who benefits from constant expansion? What alternatives exist to the current system? The first broadcast began with a simple title card, Voices from the Conquered Worlds. What followed was a carefully edited documentary that let hegemony victims tell their own stories in their own words. No human commentary was needed. The testimonies spoke for themselves. An elderly survivor from the crystalline reaches described watching hegemony forces destroy his species' memory crystals, which contained thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and cultural heritage. A former engineer from the outer colonies explained how her people's advanced technology had been confiscated and reverse-engineered, while her people were forced to work as manual laborers. A child from the recently conquered verdant systems told how her family had been separated during population optimization procedures. The documentary was broadcast simultaneously across multiple networks, reaching audiences throughout council space. Most galactic citizens had accepted the hegemony's own version of their history, which described their expansion as a noble mission to bring order and stability to chaotic regions of space. The reality was considerably different. Sir, Colonel Vex reported to General Thoros aboard the flagship Dominance. We're detecting unauthorized transmissions throughout council space. The content appears to be propaganda material targeting hegemony operations. Thoros reviewed the transmission logs with growing alarm. The broadcasts were technically legal under council communication laws, which guaranteed freedom of information exchange between member species. However, the content was devastating to hegemony interests. Can we block the transmissions? Thoros asked. Not without violating council communications protocols, Colonel Vex replied. The broadcasts are being carried through the Melody Quantum Network, which has diplomatic immunity under interspecies agreements. Interfering with their operations would constitute an act of war against a council member. The second broadcast was even more effective than the first. Titled The Cost of Conquest, it focused on the economic impact of hegemony expansion on council member species. Dr. Chen had assembled detailed financial data showing how resources were extracted from conquered territories and used to fund further military operations, rather than benefiting the galactic community. The documentary revealed that the hegemony consumed approximately 60% of the galaxy's military production while contributing less than 20% of its total economic output. Their vast fleets required constant supplies of rare materials, sophisticated equipment, and trained personnel, all of which had to be provided by other species. The question we must ask ourselves, stated the documentary's narrator, is whether this arrangement serves the interests of galactic civilization, or merely the interests of those who benefit from perpetual warfare. Trade Minister Brix of the Commerce Guild watched the broadcast with growing concern. The financial analysis was accurate and professionally presented. More importantly, It raised questions that the Commerce Guild should have been asking for decades. Why was so much galactic wealth being devoted to military expansion? What would happen to the galactic economy if those resources were devoted to peaceful development instead? The third broadcast, Alternative Futures, was perhaps the most dangerous from the hegemony's perspective. Instead of simply criticizing the current system, it presented detailed proposals for how galactic civilization could be organized differently. The proposals were based on human political and economic theories, adapted for the complex realities of interspecies cooperation. Imagine, the narrator suggested, a galaxy where disputes are resolved through negotiation rather than conquest, where trade relationships are based on mutual benefit rather than military coercion, where technological advancement is shared freely rather than hoarded by the powerful. The proposals were not presented as human ideas but as logical alternatives that any species could develop given sufficient time and motivation. The broadcasts included testimonials from council members who had already begun implementing similar policies in their own territories, demonstrating that such changes were not only possible, but actively beneficial. Elder Chorus Lirana of the Melody species found herself deeply moved by the vision presented in the human broadcasts. Her people had always believed that cooperation produced more beautiful harmonies than domination, but they had never considered applying this principle to galactic politics. The idea that the entire galaxy could function as a cooperative symphony rather than a hierarchical orchestra was both appealing and revolutionary. The cumulative effect of the broadcast campaign was extraordinary. Within weeks, public opinion throughout council space had shifted dramatically regarding the hegemony's role in galactic affairs. Species that had accepted hegemony protection as necessary were beginning to question whether that protection was worth its cost. Groups that had never considered alternatives to the current system were suddenly discussing radical changes to galactic governance. More importantly, the broadcasts were having a profound impact within hegemony territory itself. Soldiers who had believed they were serving a noble cause were confronted with evidence that their actions had caused immense suffering to innocent populations. Civilians who had accepted the necessity of constant military expansion were learning that other species lived prosperous, peaceful lives without conquering their neighbors. "Sir," reported Colonel Vex during an emergency briefing, "we're detecting significant increases in desertion rates, transfer requests, and what intelligence classifies as passive resistance among our military personnel. Morale assessments indicate a 37% decline in unit cohesion over the past month." General Thoros studied the reports with growing desperation. His military forces remained technically capable of conducting operations, but their effectiveness was declining rapidly as soldiers questioned the purpose of their missions. Equipment was being maintained less carefully, orders were being followed less precisely, and initiative was disappearing as personnel focused on completing their service obligations rather than achieving military objectives. "What about the conquest of human space?" Thoros asked. "Are we maintaining operational control over the occupied territories?" "Yes, sir, but the territories remain essentially worthless. We control empty infrastructure that requires constant maintenance, provides no economic benefit, and serves no strategic purpose. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining our presence continues to increase as equipment failures and supply problems accumulate." The final broadcast was titled simply Choice. It presented no new information and made no specific recommendations. Instead, it asked galactic citizens to consider what kind of future they wanted for themselves and their descendants. Every individual, every species, every civilization faces the same fundamental choice, the narrator concluded. We can accept the world as it is, or we can work to create the world as it should be. We can submit to the authority of those who claim to know better, or we can take responsibility for our own destiny. The choice is always ours to make. The broadcast ended with testimonials from dozens of species describing the changes they had already begun implementing in their own territories. Cooperative trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, shared research initiatives, and collaborative artistic projects were flourishing throughout council space, as species discovered they could work together without hegemony oversight. Ambassador Claire Bennett appeared before the Galactic Council one final time, representing not just humanity, but a growing coalition of species that had decided to explore alternatives to the existing order. The chamber was packed with representatives who had never participated in council proceedings before. including several species that had been subjects of hegemony conquest. The Earth government formally requests that the Council review the current structure of galactic governance, Claire announced. Recent events have demonstrated that our current system may not serve the best interests of all galactic citizens. General Thoros watched the proceedings from the military observer gallery, realizing that he had achieved complete tactical victory while suffering total strategic defeat. His forces controlled human space, but humanity had transformed the nature of galactic civilization itself. He had won every battle while losing the war in ways that traditional military doctrine could not address or counter. The humans had proven that ideas could be more powerful than weapons, that moral authority could overcome military superiority, and that the most devastating victory was convincing your enemy that fighting was ultimately pointless. They had won without trying, simply by asking the right questions at the right time and letting others draw their own conclusions about what needed to change. The renovated council chambers buzzed with activity as representatives from 43 different species gathered for the first session of the reformed Galactic Assembly. The old hierarchical seating arrangement had been replaced with a circular design where no single position held obvious superiority over others. Ambassador Claire Bennett occupied the same simple chair she had used during her first appearance before the council, but now it sat among equals rather than in the supplicant's position. The transformation had taken exactly 1 year to complete, though the process had accelerated dramatically in the final months, as species after species declared their independence from hegemony oversight. The tipping point had come when the Commerce Guild formally announced that trade relationships would no longer be governed by military considerations, followed within days by the Melody species declaring their communication network open to all peaceful civilizations, regardless of political affiliation. General Thoros had withdrawn hegemony forces from human space 6 months earlier, not because of military defeat but because maintaining the occupation had become economically and politically impossible. The empty territories provided no strategic value while consuming resources that were desperately needed elsewhere as hegemony authority crumbled throughout their traditional sphere of influence. The First Order of Business, announced Councillor Vorthak, who now served as rotating chairperson rather than permanent authority figure, is the formal recognition of new diplomatic relationships established under the Cooperative Accords. The Cooperative Accords represented humanity's most significant contribution to galactic civilization. Instead of the old system where relationships were determined by military power and enforced through threat of conquest, the new framework was based on voluntary cooperation and mutual benefit. Species could form partnerships, share resources, and collaborate on projects without requiring approval from any central authority. The result had been an explosion of innovation and prosperity throughout the galaxy as species were free to pursue their natural strengths without artificial restrictions. The artistic Melody species had established cultural exchanges with 17 different civilizations, creating new forms of beauty that no single species could have imagined alone. The technically skilled Commerce Guild had developed trade networks that increased prosperity for all participants, rather than extracting wealth for distant military campaigns. I would like to address the Assembly regarding the current status of former hegemony territories, announced Diplomat Lyric of the Liberation Coalition, a new organization representing species that had declared independence over the past year. The hegemony still existed but had been reduced to approximately 1/3 of its former territory as subject species either declared independence or negotiated autonomous status within a reformed confederation. General Thoros had been replaced by a civilian council that was attempting to transform hegemony society from a military hierarchy into something more compatible with the new galactic order. The transformation had not been without violence. Hardline hegemony elements had attempted several military coups, and some regions had experienced civil conflicts as different factions struggled for control. However, the violence had been contained and brief as most hegemony citizens discovered that peaceful alternatives were more attractive than continued warfare. The Liberation Coalition wishes to formally thank the human delegation for their assistance in developing transition frameworks, Lyric continued. The political and economic models they shared have proven invaluable in establishing stable, democratic institutions in our territories. Claire nodded gracefully, though she knew that human assistance had been far more extensive than most galactic citizens realized. Human advisors had worked quietly throughout the galaxy, sharing expertise in constitutional law, democratic governance, and economic development that had been refined through centuries of human political evolution. The assistance had been provided freely, without conditions or expectations of special treatment. Dr. Amy Rodriguez, now serving as Earth's chief scientific advisor to the Assembly, presented a report on the collaborative research initiatives that had emerged from the new cooperative framework. Joint research projects now involve an average of 4.3 different species per initiative, compared to single-species projects under the old system. Innovation rates have increased by approximately 240%, while research costs have decreased by an average of 60%. The scientific renaissance had been one of the most visible benefits of the new order. Species were sharing knowledge freely, building on each other's discoveries and tackling problems that no single civilization could have solved alone. Medical advances were being distributed throughout the galaxy, rather than hoarded for strategic advantage. Environmental restoration techniques were being applied to damaged worlds regardless of their political affiliation. Captain David Park, now director of the Interspecies Cultural Exchange Program, reported on the social changes that were transforming galactic civilization. We have documented the emergence of 127 new collaborative art forms, 89 hybrid cuisines, and 312 cultural festivals that celebrate the diversity of galactic civilization. More importantly, we are seeing the development of shared values and common identity that transcend species boundaries. The cultural transformation had been perhaps the most profound change of all. Young people throughout the galaxy were growing up with friends from different species, learning multiple languages, and thinking of themselves as galactic citizens rather than members of isolated civilizations. Interspecies marriage and adoption were becoming common, creating families that embodied the cooperative principles of the new order. Trade Minister Brix, now head of the Reformed Commerce Guild, presented economic data that demonstrated the material benefits of the new system. Galactic economic output has increased by 180% since the implementation of cooperative trade frameworks. More significantly, the benefits are being distributed more equitably, with formerly impoverished regions experiencing the highest growth rates. The economic boom had resulted from redirecting resources away from military expenditures toward productive investments. The vast fleets and armies that had consumed so much galactic wealth were being converted into exploration vessels, research stations and infrastructure projects that benefited everyone rather than threatening anyone. However, Brix continued, we must acknowledge that some regions are still struggling with the transition. Former hegemony core worlds have experienced economic disruption as their military-industrial complexes adapt to peaceful production. We recommend expanded assistance programs to help these populations develop new economic foundations. The comment highlighted one of the ongoing challenges of the transformation. Species that had built their entire civilization around conquest and domination were finding it difficult to adapt to a galaxy where cooperation was more profitable than coercion. Some had embraced the change enthusiastically, while others remained bitter and resentful about their loss of status. Elder Chorus Lyrana of the Melody species offered to expand her people's communication network to support the assistance programs. We have been honored to facilitate the conversations that made this transformation possible. We will continue to provide our services to any species seeking to participate in the cooperative framework. The Melody Network had become the nervous system of the new galactic order, carrying not just official communications but the constant flow of cultural, scientific, and commercial exchange that bound the galaxy together. More importantly, the transparent nature of the network had made it almost impossible for any group to secretly plan aggressive actions against their neighbors. The session concluded with Ambassador Claire addressing the Assembly one final time as humanity's representative. In 6 months, the rotating leadership system would place a human in the chairperson role for the first time, a responsibility that both honored and concerned the Earth government. When my species first encountered galactic civilization, Claire said, we were overwhelmed by its complexity and awed by its achievements. We accepted our place as newcomers seeking to learn from our more experienced neighbors. She paused, looking around the chamber at representatives who had become colleagues and friends rather than distant authority figures. What we discovered was that our neighbors were seeking the same things we were: security for their families, prosperity for their communities, and hope for their future. The only difference was that we had learned to achieve these goals through cooperation rather than conquest. The comment drew appreciative harmonies from the melody, delegation and approval gestures from dozens of other species. Today we are no longer newcomers seeking guidance. We are partners working together to build a galaxy where every species can pursue their dreams without fear of aggression or oppression. This transformation was not achieved through military victory or technological superiority. It was achieved by proving that cooperation produces better results than coercion. Later, as the session adjourned and representatives began making plans for the next round of collaborative projects, Claire reflected on the strange journey that had brought humanity from primitive newcomers to leaders of galactic transformation. The 5 traits that had made victory possible, pattern breaking, social engineering, asymmetric thinking, persistence, and moral warfare, had never been intended as weapons. They were simply the natural result of human social evolution on a world where survival had always depended on adaptation and cooperation. The irony was that humanity had won their war without realizing they were fighting one. Every diplomatic mission, every cultural exchange, every innocent question about alternatives to the existing order had been part of a campaign to transform galactic civilization. But it had never been planned as a military operation. It had simply been humans doing what humans naturally did, making friends, solving problems, and asking why things had to be the way they were. General Thoros, now a private citizen living quietly on a reformed hegemony world, had requested a meeting with Claire during her visit to his system. They sat in a simple cafe, 2 individuals who had shaped galactic history through their choices during a critical moment. "I still don't understand how you did it," Thoros admitted. "My forces were superior in every measurable category. We controlled the territory, dominated the space lanes, and possessed overwhelming military advantage." Claire smiled, stirring her tea as she considered how to explain something that had become obvious only in retrospect. "General," she said gently, "you were fighting the wrong war. You were trying to conquer territory and defeat military forces. We were trying to change minds and hearts. You succeeded completely in your objectives and lost anyway. We failed completely in traditional military terms and won everything that mattered." Thoros nodded slowly, finally understanding the lesson that had taken him years to learn. "The galaxy is a better place now," he admitted. "Even my own people are happier and more prosperous than they were during our military dominance. I suppose that makes you the better general, even though you never commanded a single warship." Claire raised her cup in a mock toast. "To victories that don't require defeating anyone," she said. "And to the discovery that the best way to win a war is to convince everyone involved that peace is more fun." The transformation of galactic civilization was complete, but the real victory was simpler than anyone had imagined. Humans had won by proving that asking the right questions was more powerful than having the right answers, and that the strongest force in the universe was the idea that everyone deserved a chance to choose their own destiny. 5 humans, representing a species that could win wars without even trying, had changed everything by doing nothing more complicated than being themselves.